I still remember that morning as if time itself refused to let it fade away. It was one of those mornings that feel too perfect to be real. Soft sunlight stretching gently across the sky, a cool breeze brushing against my face, and the quiet comfort of knowing my child's small hand was wrapped safely in mine. If I had known what that day would become, I would have held on tighter, much tighter. We had made a habit of morning walks. It was our little routine, something simple yet deeply meaningful. Life had not always been kind to me, but those early hours, just me and my child, felt like a small reward from the world. The streets were calm, the noise of the day still asleep, and everything carried a sense of peace that I had come to depend on. My child loved these walks more than anything. There was a kind of innocent excitement in every step, in every little thing noticed along the way, a bird flying low, the rustling leaves, even the distant sound of a passing bicycle. I would often look down and smile, thinking how something so small could hold so much happiness. That morning was no different, or at least it didn't feel different. I remember adjusting my dupatta with one hand while holding onto those tiny fingers with the other. My child was talking, endlessly, joyfully, about something I can no longer recall. That's the cruel part of memory. It holds onto the pain but lets go of the laughter. We reached the usual turn near the road. It wasn't a very busy road, but it wasn't empty either. I had crossed it hundreds of times before, always carefully, always alert. That day, I thought I was being careful too. I looked to my right, then to my left. There was a car in the distance. Not too close, not too fast, or at least that's what I believed in that moment. I tightened my grip slightly, preparing to cross. And then it happened. In a split second, everything changed. My child saw something across the road, something that caught their attention with that sudden spark only children have. Before I could react, before I could even understand what was happening, those tiny fingers slipped out of my hand. I can still feel that moment. That exact second when the warmth disappeared. "Wait," I shouted. But my voice was too slow. My body was too slow. Time itself was too slow. My child ran forward, small, excited steps that didn't understand danger, didn't understand fear. Just pure, innocent curiosity pulling them forward. And then I heard it. The sound of the car. Louder now. Closer. Too close. I ran. I screamed. I reached out with everything I had, but the distance between us suddenly felt like an endless road I could never cross. Everything blurred after that. The sound of brakes screeching. A sharp, unbearable noise. A silence that followed, heavier than anything I had ever known. For a moment, the world stopped. Completely stopped. I don't remember falling, but I remember being on the ground. I don't remember how I reached there, but I remember holding my child. I don't remember breathing, but I remember screaming. People gathered. Voices surrounded me. Someone was saying something, maybe trying to help, maybe calling for assistance, but their words felt distant, like echoes in a place I could no longer reach. All I could see was my child. All I could feel was the weight of a moment I couldn't undo. I kept saying the same words over and over again. "I'm here, I'm here, I'm here." As if saying it enough times could bring everything back. As if my voice could reverse time. As if holding on now could make up for letting go then. But life doesn't work that way. It never has. That morning, which had started with peace, ended with something I still cannot name. It wasn't just pain. It wasn't just loss. It was something deeper. Something that settles inside your soul and refuses to leave. People say it was an accident. People say these things happen. People say I shouldn't blame myself. But they weren't there. They didn't feel that hand slipping away. They didn't hear my voice arrive too late. They didn't live that 1 second, the 1 second that changed everything. If I close my eyes, I can still go back there. To that road. To that moment. To that version of me who didn't know what was coming. And every time, I want to scream at her. Hold tighter. Don't look away. Don't take that step. Don't let go. But she never hears me. She just smiles and keeps walking. And the morning begins again. After that moment, time no longer moved the way it used to. It didn't flow, it dragged. Each second felt heavier than the last, as if the world had suddenly become too difficult to carry. I remember people surrounding me, their faces filled with shock, concern, fear, but none of it felt real. It was as if I had been separated from everything around me, trapped inside a moment that refused to end. Someone tried to lift me, but I wouldn't let go. I couldn't let go. My hands were trembling as I held my child close to me, as if holding tighter could somehow undo what had just happened. I kept whispering softly, desperately, repeating the same words again and again. Nothing will happen, I'm here, I'm here. But even as I said it, something inside me knew those words had already lost their meaning. The sound of sirens began to rise in the distance. At first, it felt faint, almost unreal. But then it grew louder, sharper, cutting through everything around me. People stepped back, voices became urgent, and suddenly there were hands trying to guide me, to pull me away, to take control of a situation I had already lost. I remember being placed into a vehicle. I don't even recall how I got there. One moment I was on the road, and the next I was inside, surrounded by strangers who were speaking quickly, doing things I couldn't understand. Everything was moving fast, but my mind was stuck in that 1 second. That 1 second when the hand slipped away. I kept looking down, hopping, praying that if I just kept looking, something would change, that I would wake up from whatever nightmare this was, that my child would open their eyes and look at me the way they always did, trusting, innocent, full of life. But nothing changed. The ride felt endless, even though it couldn't have been very long. Every turn, every sudden stop, every movement felt like a delay I couldn't afford. I wanted to scream at them to go faster, to do something, to fix this, but no words came out. I had already used all my voice on that road. When we reached the hospital, everything became louder again. Doors opening. Footsteps rushing. Voices calling out instructions. They took my child from my arms. That was the moment I felt something inside me break in a way I cannot describe. Until then, I had held on physically, desperately, but when they carried my child away, I was left with empty hands. Empty hands, and a heart that no longer knew how to beat the same way. I tried to follow, but someone stopped me. I don't know who it was. I don't remember their face. I just remember being held back while they disappeared behind doors I wasn't allowed to cross. "Please," I whispered. Just one word. But it carried everything inside me. No one answered. Or maybe they did, but I couldn't hear anything except the silence growing inside my chest. I sat there, frozen, unable to move, unable to think. People came and went. Some looked at me with sympathy, others avoided my eyes altogether. I must have looked broken because I was. Time passed. Minutes, maybe hours. I couldn't tell. At some point, someone came to speak to me. Their lips were moving, their expression serious, but the words felt distant, like they belonged to another world. I kept staring at them, trying to understand, trying to make sense of anything they were saying. But all I could think was, this isn't real. This cannot be real. Things like this don't happen to people like me. Not in the middle of a peaceful morning. Not in the middle of a simple walk. Not in the middle of a life that was just ordinary. I shook my head slowly, as if refusing to accept whatever reality was being placed in front of me. "No," I whispered, over and over again. "No, no, no." As if denial could protect me. As if refusing to believe it could somehow change it. But reality does not ask for permission. It arrives. And it stays. I remember finally being allowed to see my child again. That walk down the hospital corridor felt longer than any journey I had ever taken. Each step was heavy, filled with fear I didn't know how to carry. When I reached the door, my hands began to shake uncontrollably. I didn't want to open it. because some part of me knew that whatever was on the other side would change everything forever. But I had to. I slowly pushed the door open. And there it was. The stillness. The silence. The absence of everything that had once made my world feel alive. I stepped closer, each breath harder than the last. I wanted to say something, to call out, to bring back even the smallest piece of what I had lost, but no words came. I just stood there, looking, waiting, hopping, but nothing moved. Nothing changed. And in that moment, I realized something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Some mistakes don't just hurt you. They take everything from you and leave you behind to remember it all. The days that followed did not feel like days at all. They felt like fragments, broken pieces of time that refused to fit together. Morning would come, but it brought no light. Night would fall, but it offered no rest. Everything continued, yet nothing felt real. I remember sitting in that same room long after everyone else had left. The silence had changed. It was no longer just quiet, it had weight. It pressed against me, surrounded me, filled every space where laughter once lived. People came to console me. They spoke softly, carefully, as if their words might shatter me further. I could see their lips moving, hear faint echoes of sympathy, but nothing reached me. What could anyone say that would make this different? What words could undo a moment that had already happened? None. There are no words for that kind of loss. Someone placed a hand on my shoulder. I didn't react. Another tried to guide me to stand, but my body refused. It was as if I had become part of the chair, rooted in a reality I could not escape. I kept replaying it. Again. And again. And again. That 1 second. That one slip. That one moment when my hand wasn't strong enough. I began to question everything. Why did I look away? Why didn't I hold tighter? Why didn't I pick my child up instead of walking? Why did I think there was enough time? Each question came like a wave, crashing into me with more force than the last. And each time, the answer was the same. Because I didn't know. But not knowing does not ease the pain. It only deepens it. At some point, they told me it was time to go home. Home. That word used to mean comfort, safety, warmth. Now it felt like something I was afraid to face. I didn't want to go back, because I knew what was waiting for me there. Absence. Memories. Silence. But they insisted, and I was too tired to resist. The journey back felt different from every other journey I had ever taken. The roads looked the same, the buildings hadn't changed, people were still living their lives, but everything felt distant, like I no longer belonged to that world. When I stepped inside the house, I paused. My eyes immediately searched for something that wasn't there anymore. A small pair of shoes near the door. A toy left carelessly on the floor. A voice calling out for me. Nothing. The house was exactly as we had left it, but it no longer felt like home. I walked slowly through each room, as if I was entering a place I had never seen before. Every corner held a memory. Every object carried a piece of a life that had been taken from me in a single moment. I reached the room that once held so much life. My hands trembled as I pushed the door open. Inside, everything was untouched. The bed. The toys. The small things that once seemed so ordinary. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in a way that felt unbearable. I picked up a toy, one that had been played with just hours before that morning, and held it close to my chest. It still felt warm. Or maybe that was just my imagination refusing to let go. I sank to the floor. And for the first time since it happened, I cried. Not the kind of crying people hear. Not loud. Not dramatic. It was quiet. Broken. The kind that comes from somewhere deep inside, where pain lives without words. Tears fell, one after another, each carrying a memory, a regret, a piece of a life I could never get back. "I'm sorry," I whispered, over and over again. "I'm so sorry." But apologies don't travel back in time. They don't fix what has been broken. They don't bring back what has been lost. They only remain, echoing in the silence, unanswered. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the emptiness around me. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. Every second felt like it was stretching endlessly. I closed my eyes at one point, and I saw it again. That road. That moment. That hand slipping away. I opened my eyes immediately, my heart racing, my breath uneven. I didn't want to see it again, but it was already part of me now. Something I couldn't escape. Days turned into nights. Nights turned into days. But nothing changed. People expected time to heal something like this. But time didn't heal anything. It only made the silence louder. The absence clearer. The regret deeper. I stopped going outside. I stopped answering calls. I stopped being part of the world. Because how could I return to a life that no longer felt like mine? How could I smile, speak, exist, when everything inside me had already stopped? Sometimes, I would sit near the window and watch people pass by. Mothers holding their children's hands. Children laughing, running, unaware of the dangers around them. And every time, my chest would tighten. I wanted to scream at them. Hold on tighter. Don't let go. Not even for a second. But I never did. I just watched. Silently. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew how quickly a peaceful morning could turn into a lifetime of pain. And that knowledge was something I would carry forever. The world outside continued as if nothing had happened. Mornings still arrived with the same soft light. Birds still sang. People still stepped out of their homes, chasing their routines, their responsibilities, their lives. Everything moved forward. Everything except me. I remained stuck in that one moment, that 1 second that refused to let me go. It followed me everywhere, into every room, every breath, every thought. Even when I tried not to think about it, it was there, waiting, reminding me of what I had lost and what I had done. People said I needed to be strong. But strength felt meaningless now. What was strength when the one person I needed to be strong for was no longer there? They told me I wasn't alone. But loneliness doesn't disappear just because someone says it shouldn't exist. It settles deeper when the one presence that filled your life is gone. Relatives began visiting more often in those days. They would sit beside me, speak gently, offer comfort in ways they believed would help. Some would remind me that it was God's will. Others would tell me that everything happens for a reason. I listened. Or at least I tried to. But those words felt distant, like they belonged to a world I no longer understood. What reason could possibly justify a moment like that? What meaning could there be in losing everything in the blink of an eye? I never asked these questions out loud, because I knew there were no answers. One afternoon, someone suggested I should go outside for a while. Fresh air will help, they said. Help? That word had started to feel strange to me. What could possibly help this? Still, I agreed. Maybe because I was tired of the same walls. Maybe because I thought, for a brief moment, that stepping outside might make things feel different. But I was wrong. The moment I stepped onto the street, my heart began to race. The air felt heavier, the sounds sharper, the space around me unfamiliar. And then I saw it. That road. The same road. The same place where everything had changed. My step slowed. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I thought I would collapse right there. I wanted to turn back. To run. To escape. But something held me there. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the need to face it. Or maybe it was the quiet voice inside me that refused to let me forget. I walked closer. Each step felt like I was moving through something thick and invisible, something that resisted me, something that didn't want me to reach that place again. But I did. I stood there, exactly where it had happened. The road looked the same. Cars passed by like they always did. People walked without noticing. Nothing marked the moment that had destroyed my world. Nothing showed that something irreversible had taken place there. It was just a road. Ordinary. Unchanged. And that made it worse. Because how could something so ordinary hold something so painful? How could the world continue without acknowledging what had happened? I closed my eyes. And instantly, it came back. The sound. The movement. The moment. I saw my child again, running forward, unaware, innocent. I saw myself, reaching out too late. I heard my own voice, calling out, breaking. My hands began to shake. I stepped back, then further back until I could no longer stand there. I turned and walked away quickly, my heart pounding, my chest tight, my breath uneven. I didn't look back. I couldn't. That place was no longer just a road. It was a memory I could not survive reliving. That evening, I sat alone in the house again. The silence had become familiar now, almost expected. But it never became easier. I found myself holding on to small things, objects, memories, anything that still connected me to what I had lost. A piece of clothing. A toy. Even the faint echo of laughter that sometimes played in my mind. I began talking to those memories. Quietly, as if they could hear me. As if somewhere, somehow, my voice could reach what was no longer here. I didn't mean to let go, I whispered one night. I thought I had you, I thought you were safe. My voice broke before I could finish. There was no answer. There would never be an answer. But still I spoke. Because silence felt heavier when I didn't. Days turned into weeks. And slowly, something inside me began to change, not in a way that healed me, but in a way that made me more aware of the reality I was living in. The denial began to fade. And in its place came something harder to carry. Acceptance. Not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that forces you to see the truth clearly. It happened. I couldn't change it. I couldn't undo it. I couldn't go back. That one moment was now part of me. A part I would carry forever. Some nights I would sit by the window and watch the sky grow dark. I would think about all the things I used to worry about, small problems, daily struggles, things that once felt important. None of them mattered anymore. Because now, I knew what real loss felt like. And once you know that, everything else becomes quiet. Empty. Insignificant. I often wondered what life would look like if that morning had been different. If I had held on tighter. If I had reacted faster. If I had made a different choice. But those thoughts only led me back to the same place. The same moment. The same regret. And no matter how many times I replayed it, the ending never changed. Because some stories don't give you a second chance. They just stay with you. Unfinished. Unforgiving. And impossible to forget. After a while, people stopped talking about it in front of me. Not because they forgot, but because they didn't know what else to say anymore. At first, their presence was constant. Relatives, neighbors, acquaintances who came with heavy faces and softer voices. But slowly, one by one, they returned to their own lives. The visits became less frequent. The sympathy faded into silence, and I was left alone with something that no one else could carry for me. Life has a strange way of moving on, even when you don't. I stayed in the same place, but everything around me kept shifting forward. Days no longer had meaning. Morning and night blended into each other until I stopped noticing the difference. I would wake up without purpose, sit without thought, and sleep without rest. Sometimes I would sit in the same corner of the house for hours, staring at nothing. My body would be there, but my mind was somewhere else, always back on that road, always back on that moment. There were times when I thought I heard footsteps. Soft ones, small ones, the kind that used to run toward me before I even called. I would turn quickly, my heart suddenly hopeful, only to find emptiness. Just silence. Just memory. And each time, the disappointment felt like a fresh wound. I stopped reacting after a while. Stopped turning. Stopped hopping. Hope had become too painful. One evening, while sitting alone, I found myself holding my hands together tightly. I didn't even realize I was doing it until I felt the pressure. My fingers were clenched so hard they were shaking. That's when I remembered. That hand. That small hand slipping away. I immediately let go of my own hands, as if even my own grip reminded me of what I had lost. My breathing became uneven. I stood up quickly and walked outside the room, trying to escape my own thoughts. But there is no escape from memory. It follows you. Quietly. Patiently. Relentlessly. Outside, the sky was turning orange. The same kind of evening light I used to enjoy once upon a time. I remember thinking how beautiful sunsets used to feel before pain changed the way I saw everything. Now even beauty felt distant. Unreachable. I stood near the door, watching the street. Children were playing nearby. Their laughter filled the air in a way that felt almost painful. I watched them run without fear, without awareness of how fragile moments can be. I watched mothers calling out to them, holding their hands, guiding them gently. And something inside me tightened again. I wanted to look away. But I couldn't, because I saw myself in every mother. And I saw my child in every child. A tear slipped down my face without warning. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just quiet. Like everything else in my life now. I wiped it quickly, as if someone might notice, even though there was no one watching. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay down, but my eyes stayed open. The ceiling above me felt too still, too blank. My mind refused to rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the road again. Every time I tried to breathe deeply, I felt that moment return. I turned to my side, then the other. Nothing helped. At some point, I sat up and held my head in my hands. I whispered into the darkness. But there was no reply. Only silence. Only the sound of my own breath. There were nights when I spoke aloud, not to anyone, but just to release what was trapped inside me. I should have been faster. I should have held tighter. I should have known. Each sentence ended in regret. Each thought ended in blame. But deep inside, I also knew something else. Even if I had done everything right, even if I had been perfect, life doesn't always ask permission before changing everything. But knowing that didn't lessen the pain. It only made it heavier in a different way. One morning, I found myself standing near the same window I used to stand at before all of this happened. The light was soft again. The world outside looked unchanged. And for a moment, I felt something unfamiliar. Not happiness. Not peace. But a memory of who I used to be. Before fear. Before guilt. Before loss. I remembered laughing easily. I remembered walking without hesitation. I remembered holding that tiny hand without thinking that one day I would have to remember what it felt like instead of feeling it again. That realization broke something inside me all over again. Because I understood clearly now. There is no returning to who you were before certain moments. No matter how much time passes. No matter how much you wish it could be different. Some versions of us only exist in memory now. And I was one of them. Lost somewhere between what was and what can never be again. After that morning, I stopped counting days. Time had lost its structure for me. It no longer mattered whether it was Monday or Friday, morning or evening. Every day felt the same, quiet, heavy, and unfinished. People sometimes ask how grief changes a person. I don't think it changes you all at once. It slowly takes pieces of you, one by one, until you no longer recognize who you were before. I began noticing small things first. I stopped responding to my own reflection in the mirror. I stopped caring about how I looked. I stopped preparing meals properly, even when hunger reminded me that I should. Even basic things that once felt natural, became difficult. As if the part of me that used to care had quietly stepped away. One afternoon, I found myself sitting near the same place where my child used to sit while playing. The space was empty, of course, but my mind filled it anyway. I could almost see it, the small figure sitting there, talking, laughing, asking questions that never ended. I reached out my hand without thinking. Just slightly, as if expecting it to be held again. But my hand stopped in the air, and reality returned. I slowly lowered it, my chest tightening. That simple instinct, that natural movement, felt like betrayal from my own body. Even my body remembered what I was trying so hard to forget. I stood up and walked outside, needing air, needing distance from my thoughts. The street was quiet that day. A few people passed by, but no one stopped. Everyone was busy with their own lives, their own destinations, their own worries. I watched them and wondered how life could feel so normal for them. How the world could continue without hesitation. How everything could still look so ordinary after something so unordinary had happened to me. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected, because it made me realize something painful. The world does not pause for anyone's grief. It moves forward regardless, even when you cannot. I walked slowly without direction, not knowing where I was going, only knowing that staying still felt heavier than movement. At some point, I reached a small roadside area where a few trees stood. I stopped there and sat down under the shade. The wind was gentle. The sound of distant traffic was faint. For a moment, it almost felt peaceful. Almost. But peace is not something grief allows for long. It always finds a way to return. I closed my eyes briefly, and immediately I saw it again. Not the hospital, not the aftermath, but that exact moment. The hand slipping, the movement forward, the sound of my voice breaking in the air. I opened my eyes quickly and pressed my palm against my chest, as if trying to steady something inside me that refused to stay still. "Why?" I whispered softly, though I didn't expect an answer. There was none. There never had been. I sat there for a long time. People passed by. Some looked at me briefly and continued walking. No one knew what had happened inside me. No one could. And maybe that was the hardest part. Grief is invisible to those who are not carrying it. Later that day, I returned home as the sky began to darken. The house was still the same, but I noticed how quiet it had become, not just without sound, but without life. Even the smallest noises felt absent. I went to the room again. That room. The one I kept returning to even when I didn't want to. I stood at the door for a moment before entering. My feet felt heavy, but I stepped inside anyway. Everything was still in its place. Unmoved. Unchanged. As if waiting. Or maybe that was just my imagination again. I walked slowly toward the corner and sat down on the floor, the same place where I had broken down before. This time, I didn't cry immediately. I just sat, silent, breathing, letting the weight sit with me instead of running from it. After a while, I spoke, not loudly, not clearly, just enough for the room to hear. "I'm still here." My voice trembled. "I don't know how to move forward, but I'm still here." Silence answered me again. But this time, something inside me felt slightly different. Not healed. Not fixed. Just present. As if acknowledging that I was still alive, even in the middle of everything that had broken me. That night, I didn't fight sleep as much as I used to. I lay down and let exhaustion take over. But even as sleep approached, my mind stayed restless. Images came and went. Moments. Faces. Feelings I couldn't escape. And somewhere between waking and sleeping, I realized something quietly devastating. I was learning to live with the pain. Not because it was gone, but because it had become part of me. And once something becomes part of you, you carry it everywhere. Even in silence, there are some pains that do not scream anymore. They settle. They become quiet. And that quietness is what makes them even harder to bear. By this time, I had stopped crying every day. The tears had not disappeared. They had just become rarer, as if even they were tired of coming out. Instead, there was a constant heaviness inside me, something that never left, something that simply stayed. I started noticing how I spoke less, how my voice felt unfamiliar, even to myself. Sometimes I would try to say something simple, just a sentence, just a thought, but my words would stop halfway, as if they had no place to go anymore. It felt like I had lost more than just a child. I had lost the version of myself who used to speak freely, laugh easily, and believe that life was safe. One morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I wanted to, but because sleep had ended suddenly, as it often did. The room was dim, the air was still, and for a moment I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering why mornings still came so naturally when nothing inside me felt natural anymore. I slowly sat up. My body felt heavy, but not physically, emotionally heavy, as if carrying something invisible that never left. I stood and walked toward the kitchen. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. I made tea without thinking much, just following old habits. Habits are strange. They continue even when meaning disappears. My hands moved automatically, as if remembering a life I no longer fully belonged to. When I held the cup, I noticed my hands trembling slightly. Not from cold. From something deeper. Something that never fully settled. I sat near the window again. This had become my place. My silent place. My observing place. Outside, life continued exactly as before. People walked, talked, laughed. A man passed by carrying groceries. A child ran past, chasing something invisible to adults. And I watched. Always watched. Never part of it anymore. Just outside of it. There was a time when I used to think pain would eventually make sense. That if I waited long enough, if I endured enough, I would understand why things happened the way they did. But now I know something different. Some pain does not become clear with time. It only becomes familiar. That day, I found myself thinking about small details I had once ignored. The way my child used to hold my finger instead of my hand. The way their voice would change when excited. The way they would look back at me while running, just to make sure I was still there. Those small memories hurt the most. Because they were ordinary. And ordinary things are what you miss the most when they are gone. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting those memories pass through me without resistance. But even memories have weight. And they don't leave quietly. Later that afternoon, I went outside again. I don't know why. Maybe because staying inside felt like drowning. Maybe because the silence of the house had become too loud. I walked slowly through the street, not following any direction. My steps were slow, almost uncertain. I passed familiar places, but they no longer felt familiar. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. At a small distance, I saw a mother holding her child's hand tightly while crossing the road. That simple sight stopped me completely. I stood still, watching. The grip of that hand, the careful steps, the way the child trusted without fear. And suddenly, my chest tightened again. Not because I was angry, not because I was jealous, but because I remembered. I remembered exactly how it felt to hold a hand like that, and to lose it in the same world where others still held theirs safely. I turned away slowly. Because I couldn't keep watching. Not today. Maybe not ever. I walked back home without realizing how long I had been outside. When I entered, the house felt colder than before. Not temperature-wise, but emotionally, like something had been drained from it. I sat on the floor again. Same place. Same silence. But this time, something inside me shifted slightly. Not healing. Not peace. But understanding. A quiet understanding that pain does not end by resisting it. It only softens when you stop fighting its existence. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't try to escape the memory. I let it sit with me. I let it breathe. That road. That morning. That hand slipping away. I didn't run from it this time. And in that stillness, I realized something I had been avoiding all along. My life would never return to what it was. But I was still here. Breathing. Existing. Carrying something I didn't choose. And maybe, just maybe, that was all I could do now. Just continue. Even if slowly. Even if broken. Even if forever changed. After that realization, something inside me became quieter, not healed, not lighter, just quieter. It is strange how even suffering changes its form over time. At first, it screams inside you, then it weeps, and eventually it just sits there, like a shadow that never leaves your side. I stopped resisting it as much. Not because I accepted what had happened, but because I no longer had the strength to fight it every second of the day. Some battles end not because you win or lose, but because you simply become too tired to continue. My mornings remained the same. I would wake up without urgency, without purpose, and without expectation. The first few seconds after opening my eyes were always the hardest, because for a brief moment, my mind would forget and then remember again. That memory always arrived the same way. Sudden, sharp, uninvited. And every time, it felt like losing something all over again. I would sit on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing, trying to gather myself enough to begin another day that didn't feel like mine. Outside, the world kept moving forward. Inside me, everything remained stuck. One morning, while preparing tea again, I noticed how carefully I was moving. Each action felt slower, more deliberate. It wasn't tiredness, it was hesitation, as if even small tasks required emotional permission now. I placed the cup on the table and sat down. The silence in the house was no longer surprising. It had become expected. But expectations do not make silence easier. They only make it familiar. I looked around the room and realized how much emptiness can change a space. It wasn't that things were missing. It was that someone was missing from everything. Even air feels different when presence disappears from it. I took a small sip of tea, but I barely tasted it. My mind drifted again, as it often did, back to memories I didn't choose but couldn't escape. Laughter that used to fill corners of the house. Small footsteps echoing in hallways. A voice calling my name with excitement only children understand. And then silence again. I closed my eyes briefly. I didn't want to go there. But grief doesn't ask permission before returning. That day, I decided to clean the house. Not because it needed cleaning, but because I needed something to occupy my hands. Sometimes, doing something physical feels like a way to silence thoughts, even if only temporarily. I began slowly. Dusting surfaces. Organizing small things. Moving from room to room without thinking too deeply. But every object carried a memory. A small shirt folded in the corner. A toy that had rolled under the bed. A pair of shoes that no longer served their purpose. Each item stopped me for a few seconds longer than I expected. And each pause came with its own silence. Its own pain. At one point, I held a small toy in my hand. I don't even remember picking it up. It was light, worn, familiar. And suddenly, I couldn't move. I just stood there, holding it, breathing unevenly. It wasn't just an object. It was a reminder of everything that had been lost. My hands began to tremble again, but this time I didn't drop it immediately. I just looked at it, as if waiting for it to speak, as if waiting for it to bring back something that no longer existed. But it remained silent, like everything else. Eventually, I placed it down carefully, almost respectfully, and stepped away. That moment stayed with me longer than I expected, because I realized something painful, yet simple. Even objects carry grief when they are left behind by love. Later that afternoon, I sat near the door again. I had started doing that often, just sitting and observing the outside world without participating in it. It felt safer that way, less painful. From there, I could watch life without being pulled into it. A group of children passed by laughing loudly. Their energy filled the air for a brief moment before fading as they turned the corner. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared. And then I looked down. My hands were resting in my lap. Still, empty. There was a time when those hands were always needed. Always held. Always guiding. Now they just existed. Unused. Unneeded. I pressed them together lightly, as if trying to feel something familiar again. But all I felt was absence. That evening, the sky changed slowly. From light to orange to deep blue. I stayed outside longer than usual. Not because I wanted to, but because going back inside felt like returning to a space where thoughts became louder again. The wind was calm. The world felt distant. And for a brief moment, I didn't think about anything. No memory. No guilt. No road. Just stillness. It didn't last long, but it was enough for me to notice it. Enough to understand that even pain has pauses. Even grief breathes sometimes. When I finally stood up to go back inside, I paused at the door for a moment. I didn't look back. Not because I was strong, but because I knew if I did, I might not be able to move forward at all. And so I stepped inside. Into the silence. Into the memory. Into the life that continued to exist, even after it had stopped feeling like mine. Nights became the hardest part of my life. Not because something new happened in them, but because everything stopped happening. The world outside would quiet down, and in that quietness, everything inside me would become louder. Thoughts I could ignore during the day would return at night without mercy. Memories I had tried to bury would rise again. And the silence of the house would no longer feel like peace. It would feel like company. The wrong kind of company. The kind that reminds you of everything you are trying not to remember. I would lie down and stare at the ceiling for hours. Sometimes I would close my eyes just to escape, but even sleep had stopped offering relief. It came and went unpredictably, and when it came, it never stayed long enough. One night, I woke up suddenly. I don't know what woke me. There was no sound. No movement. Just a sudden awareness that something inside me had shifted again. I sat up slowly, trying to steady my breathing. The room was dark but familiar, still, quiet, yet my heart was racing as if I had been running. I placed my hand on my chest and tried to slow myself down. But then it came. That memory. The road. The sound. The moment. I pressed my eyes shut tightly, as if that could push it away. But it never goes away. It only waits. I got out of bed and walked slowly toward the window. Outside, everything was still. The night sky stretched endlessly above, filled with stars that felt too distant to matter. I stood there for a long time. Not thinking. Just breathing. Trying to exist without breaking. At some point, I whispered something without realizing it. I'm still here. My voice was barely audible. As if I was reminding myself. Or maybe confirming it. Because some days, even that feels uncertain. I turned away from the window and sat on the floor instead of going back to bed. The coldness of the ground felt grounding in a strange way. Real, tangible, something I could feel without memory interfering. I pulled my knees closer to my chest and rested my head against them. And in that position, something changed. Not in the world, not in the pain, but in how I was holding it. I stopped resisting the thoughts that night. I let them come, one by one, without pushing them away, without trying to fix them. The road appeared again, but I didn't run from it. The moment replayed again, but I didn't fight it. The hand slipping away returned, but I didn't deny it. I just let it exist. And in doing so, something unexpected happened. It didn't hurt less, but it hurt differently. Less like a shock, more like something I had finally stopped denying. I stayed like that until the sky outside began to lighten slightly. The first hint of morning crept in quietly, without announcing itself. Another day was beginning, whether I was ready or not. I stood up slowly and walked back to the bed, but I didn't lie down immediately. I sat there instead, watching the light grow faintly through the curtains. Morning used to mean new beginnings. Now it just meant continuation. A continuation of something I didn't know how to name anymore. Later that day, I found myself in the kitchen again, making tea again, doing things again. Life had started to become a repetition of actions, without emotion attached to them. Not because I was fine, but because I had learned how to function while not being fine. That is something no one talks about. How people continue living even when they feel like they shouldn't be able to. The body learns, even when the heart refuses. As I sat there, I noticed a sound outside. Children laughing again. I didn't move immediately this time. I just listened, let it pass through me. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to break at it. Instead, I felt something quieter. Not happiness, not acceptance, but distance. A growing distance between who I was then and who I had become now. And I realized something I had been avoiding for a long time. I was no longer living in that moment, but I was still carrying it. Everywhere. Always. And I always would. By now, I had stopped expecting life to return to what it once was. Expectation itself had become dangerous for me. Every time I allowed even a small hope to grow, it would eventually collapse under the weight of reality. So I stopped hopping. Not completely, but enough to survive the day. I learned how to exist in a way that required the least emotional energy. I spoke less. I reacted less. I moved through my routines like a shadow of myself, present but not fully engaged with anything around me. Even grief had changed its shape. It was no longer sharp and unbearable every moment. Now it was constant, like a background noise that never shuts off. Some mornings, I would wake up and sit for a long time before doing anything. I would watch the light slowly fill the room, and I would think about how something so simple could still happen every day without interruption. The world did not pause, not even once. And that realization used to hurt me deeply. But now, it just existed. One day, I went back to that road again. Not because I wanted to relive it, but because something inside me needed to see it again. To confirm it was real. To confirm it had actually happened. I walked slowly, each step heavier than the last, but not as overwhelming as before. My body remembered the fear, but my mind was quieter now. When I reached the place, I stopped. I didn't move closer immediately. I just stood there, watching. The road was the same. Cars passed by. People crossed without hesitation. Life continued exactly as it always had. And I stood there, realizing something painful yet strangely calm. The world does not hold memories the way we do. It forgets what destroys us. But we never forget. I finally stepped forward and stood exactly where it had happened. My breathing was steady, but deep inside, Something old stirred again. Not panic this time. Not collapse. Just memory. I closed my eyes briefly. And I saw it again. But instead of being pulled into it, I stayed grounded. I let it appear. And I let it pass. When I opened my eyes again, nothing had changed outside. But something inside me had shifted. I slowly stepped back. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was being dragged backward into the memory. I felt like I was standing beside it, not inside it. That difference mattered more than I expected. I turned away and walked back home without rushing. The sky above was calm. The air was normal. The world continued, without knowing what it had taken from me. That evening, I sat alone again near the window. But this time, I didn't feel completely broken by what I saw outside. I watched life pass by, and I allowed it to exist without comparing it to mine. That was new for me. Not healing, but adjustment. Later that night, I found myself thinking less about why and more about how. How do people continue after loss? How do they carry what cannot be replaced? How do they breathe in a world that no longer feels the same? I didn't have answers, but I was beginning to understand something slowly. Maybe survival is not about moving on. Maybe it is about learning how to carry what remains without letting it destroy everything else inside you. That night, I lay down earlier than usual. My body was tired, but my mind was not as chaotic as before. Thoughts still came. Memories still appeared. But they no longer controlled me the way they once did. They came, and I let them come. They stayed, and I let them stay. And eventually, they passed. Not gone. Just less overpowering. Before sleep took me, I had one final thought. Not loud. Not emotional. Just quiet understanding. I would never be who I was before that morning. That version of me belonged to a life that no longer existed. But I was still here, living forward, breathing forward, even if carrying backward pain. And somehow, that was still life. There comes a point in grief when silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling normal. Not comforting, not peaceful, just normal. I had reached that point without realizing it. My days no longer felt like a struggle in the same sharp way they once did. The pain was still there, but it no longer arrived like a storm. It had settled into something quieter, something constant, like a long shadow that follows you even when the sun is bright. I stopped measuring my strength by how much I cried, because I wasn't crying much anymore. And that frightened me at first. I thought maybe feeling less meant forgetting. But I was wrong. I hadn't forgotten. I had just learned how to carry it differently. One morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I needed to, but because my body had grown used to waking without reason. I sat near the bed for a long time before standing up. My mind was calm, but not empty. Thoughts still came, but they no longer overwhelmed me immediately. They arrived, and I observed them. Like passing clouds. I made tea again, as I always did. The same routine. The same movements. But something inside me was slightly different now. Less resistance. Less shock. More acceptance of the fact that life had become this way. I stood near the window and looked outside. The world was bright that day. People moved with purpose. Children ran ahead of their parents. A man rushed past carrying work papers. A woman called out to someone across the street. Everything was alive. And I was present within it, but not part of it in the same way anymore. But for the first time, that thought didn't break me. It only passed through me. Like wind. Later that day, I found myself going back into the room I once avoided for long periods. I didn't avoid it anymore. I didn't rush out of it either. I just entered it like any other space. Inside, the air felt still, but not heavy. I sat down in the corner where I used to sit before. My hands rested loosely in my lap, and I stayed there, not trying to escape, not trying to remember too deeply, just being there, with everything that had happened, with everything that had not changed. I realized something quietly in that moment. Pain does not disappear when you stop resisting it. It simply stops controlling your every breath. And that is a different kind of strength. Not loud, not visible, but real. That evening, I went outside again. The sky was soft, shifting between light and color. I stood at the edge of the street for a while, watching people pass by. This time, I didn't feel pulled into their lives, but I also didn't feel completely disconnected from them. It was something in between. A space where I existed without breaking, without collapsing, without disappearing into memory. I took a slow breath and realized I hadn't taken a deep breath like that in a long time. Not out of fear, not out of shock, just breathing. I walked a little further that day than I usually did. Not far, but enough to notice that my steps felt more stable than before. Less hesitant, less afraid of what I might see. When I returned home, I didn't immediately sit in silence like I used to. Instead, I stayed standing for a moment, simply observing the space around me. It still carried memories. It still carried absence. But it no longer crushed me the way it once did. That night, I sat near the window again. And as darkness slowly covered the sky, I realized something I hadn't been able to see clearly before. I was not okay. But I was continuing. And sometimes, continuing is the only form of strength life allows. Before sleeping, I whispered something very softly. Not to anyone. Not to the past. Just to myself. I am still here. And for the first time in a long time, those words did not feel like a question. They felt like truth. There is no final ending for grief. It does not close like a book. It does not disappear like a dream when you wake up. It stays. It changes shape. And it becomes part of how you live. By the time I reached what people might call after, I had stopped believing there is such a thing as fully after. There is only before and what follows. And what follows is not empty, it is just different. I still wake up with the same quiet heaviness sometimes. I still pause in certain moments when memory touches me unexpectedly. I still feel that familiar ache when I see mothers holding their children's hands tightly in the streets. But I no longer collapse under it the way I once did. Now I breathe through it. Now I let it pass without fighting to erase it. One morning, I stood near the window again. The light was soft, like it had always been. The world outside continued its rhythm, cars moving, people walking, life unfolding without pause. And I stood there quietly, watching it all. Not as someone who had returned to who they were before, but as someone who had learned how to exist after everything changed. My hands were calm now. My breath steady. Not because the pain was gone, but because I had stopped expecting it to leave. There are things in life that do not heal. They settle. They become part of your story without asking permission. And you learn, slowly, how to carry them without breaking every single time. I walked outside that day without hesitation. The road was still there. The same road. The same place. But I was no longer the same person who once stood there frozen in time. I walked past it, not forgetting, not forgiving, but continuing. And that was enough for me now, because I understood something deeply in my silence. A peaceful morning can still exist, even after a sudden mistake, even after unbearable pain. Not because the past changes, but because the human heart learns, in its own broken way, how to keep beating even after it has lost something it can never replace. And so I keep walking, with memory beside me, with love still inside me, and with a pain I will carry forever. but no longer alone in the dark.